TLDW, no. Intel Arc does not consume 1 watt at idle, at least in my system. Thank you for watching and bye! You're still here and you want to know the long version? Okay. Intel Arc A380 was released on June 14th, 2022 to a very lukewarm reception from the media. Tech outlets like Tom's Hardware, PC Magazine, and Tech PowerUp praised low temperatures, support for AV1 encoding, surprisingly good ray tracing performance, and agreed that it's great to finally have a third major player in the GPU space. At the same time, the reviewers criticized the card for buggy drivers, poor stability, high idle power consumption, and very subpar game support, especially for older titles. Fast forward a year and 3 things have happened. 1. I came across this Reddit post which claims that as long as you don't actually connect a monitor to your ARC card, you can get it down to 1 watt power consumption at idle. 2. Since the GPU shortage is over and the Intel Arc A380 is still pretty underwhelming for actual gaming, you can find this card for as little as 70 euros used on websites like eBay. And 3. Intel kinda sorta fixed their drivers in Linux, to the point where you can actually use the ARC cards for hardware transcoding in Jellyfin, and get some pretty impressive results. So naturally I decided to pull the trigger, and today we're gonna see how well this card performs when it comes to hardware video transcoding, and whether the claims of 1 watt idle actually hold water. Speaking of water, have you ever wondered about how when there's a power outage you still have water in your house? How does that work? Well, if you're curious about that and many other things, Brilliant.org has got you covered, with tons of fun and interactive online courses. In their course Everyday Physics, for example, you'll learn about how things like water towers, toilets, and refrigerators actually work, and get to know a lot about physics from the standpoint of seemingly very ordinary everyday life objects. And if you'd like to know more about large language models behind things like ChatGPT and Bard, I would definitely recommend their new course How LLMs Work. It covers a lot of basics and doesn't require deep knowledge of math, computer science, or machine learning. But if you do also want to get that deep knowledge, Brilliant has got whole learning paths for you: computer science, advanced math, data analysis, and so much more, with a very clear progression displayed to keep you motivated. In today's world of computers, every job is an IT job to some extent, so having some knowledge of computer science can go a long way to improve your career prospects. So go ahead and invest into your career today by going to brilliant.org/Wolfgang and getting your free 30-day trial. The first 200 people to sign up will also get a 20% off their annual subscription. Thank you Brilliant for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get back to our main topic. Let's start from the very beginning. Why would you want a discrete GPU for hardware video transcoding if a lot of Intel CPUs already have QuickSync built in? Well, because a lot of them also don't. A lot of Xeon CPUs don't come with integrated graphics at all, due to for F-series Intel chips. You might have bought one for your gaming rig a few years ago, and now that you've upgraded to a newer CPU, you might want to use this one in your home server. Some of you guys also have AM4 Ryzen chips, and why wouldn't you? 4000 and 5000 series Ryzen APUs can be very power efficient with the right motherboard, and if you get a Pro variant, you also get full support for ECC memory. Alas, video transcoding is the Achilles heel of the Ryzen APUs, and it's pretty much the only thing that might keep you from using one on your home server. You might also just have an older Intel CPU like this i3-6100. It does support QuickSync technically, but as you'll see later in the video, trying to transcode a 4K HDR movie using its iGPU is an exercise in frustration. So if you're in one of those situations, you've got 2 options. 1. Buy a new CPU for 150 euros, a new motherboard for around 100 euros, and possibly new RAM for another 100 euros. Or 2. Get an Intel Arc card for like 120 euros. And I think that if you're otherwise okay with the way your system performs, the second option is a no-brainer. So in theory, this is a pretty easy plug-and-play solution that should massively improve your hardware transcoding situation. And yes, this isn't limited to just Intel Arc cards. Many people have NVIDIA cards in their rig specifically for hardware video transcoding. But even though I have seen claims of 1 watt idle for the Intel cards, I'm yet to see something like that about NVIDIA. And as someone who's very interested in low power consumption, I'm really excited to test that claim. Before unboxing and installing the card, I decided to take some initial measurements without an external GPU, to basically see how much the system consumes at idle, as well as during video playback, and how well it performs when it comes to hardware transcoding. Our test system today is ASRock C236WSI, which is an Intel motherboard that takes 6th and 7th gen CPUs. As for the CPU, we've got an Intel Core i3-6100, which is a dual-core Skylake chip that comes with Intel HD Graphics 530. Since I don't have any other power supplies lying around with an 8-pin PCIe connector, I decided to put the build into my home server case. I'm also going to plug in all of my usual storage devices so that I have access to my media library. One thing that I won't plug in that I usually have in my home server is this 10 gig networking card from Intel. Since we only have one PCIe slot, we kind of need to keep it free for a graphics card. And yes, as you can see, cable management is my passion. So first off, let's talk about the idle power consumption. With no transcoding going on, the system pulls around 10.5 watts from the wall. That's with 5 SSDs and 3 hard drives in the standby mode. And since there's always at least one person in the comments calling me a fraud or claiming that I'm only showing the numbers for the CPU power consumption and not the whole system, yes, this is how much the entire system consumes from the wall, and here's an old school power meter showing that exact same number. As for C states, the lowest we can see in power top is C7, which is pretty decent. But most importantly, how does the system do when it comes to video transcoding without the Intel Arc? Well, it doesn't. My usual test is playing back this 4K HDR HEVC copy of Dune in Jellyfin. I still haven't seen the movie in full, and sometimes I'm worried that just by doing those benchmarks, I'm gonna spoil some major plot point for myself. But today I'm not worried, because trying to play back this movie using the Intel HD Graphics 530 for hardware transcoding gives us around 9.5 FPS. HD 530 doesn't support VPP tone mapping for HDR video, so we're stuck with software-based tone mapping. Not that it matters though, disabling tone mapping completely doesn't change the FPS figures at all. But hey, at least the power consumption doesn't increase too much. The whole system draws around 19 watts while transcoding the movie. Or at least trying to. It wouldn't be fair of me not to test other video resolutions, so I decided to use a little script made by Alex Kretschmar, which uses Jellyfin's fork of ffmpeg to automatically test hardware transcoding for different video formats and resolutions. And here's what the results look like. With a 1080p H264 file, we get 37.5 FPS. With a 4K H264 file, we get around 12 FPS. With a 1080p HEVC 8-bit file, we get 65 FPS, which is pretty good. And as for the 10-bit 4K HEVC decode, the i3-6100 doesn't support that format, so the test didn't run. So now that we have a point of comparison, let's unbox the Intel Arc A380 and install it into our rig. The unboxing experience is pretty typical for an entry-level GPU. Apart from the card itself, we've got nothing, actually.
I hope you're hungry for nothing.
The card itself is an ASRock Challenger version, dual slot with one fan. If your case can only accommodate low-profile PCIe cards, ASRock also makes a low-profile dual-fan version of this card. As far as I know, all A380 variants are dual slot though, so if you only have one physical slot space to spare, you're out of luck. Now, Intel does make a single-slot professional version of this card, Arc Pro A40, which, you guessed it, is impossible to find online, and when you do, it's prohibitively expensive. We're also going to need an additional cable for the PCIe power, since this GPU takes an 8-pin power connector, which is pretty frustrating since the card is rated for 75 watts max. Couldn't they just cap it to 65 watts instead and ditch the connector completely? Hello everyone, Editing Wolfgang here, and guess what? They wouldn't even have to cap it at all. The PCIe slot can provide 75 watts. Why, Intel? Just why? Using an 8-pin power connector really limits the use of this card in pre-builds and server chassis, which might have proprietary power supplies with no PCIe power connectors. Sure, you can always use Molex adapters, but Anyway, the GPU fits perfectly into the case and it's also not too long, which is great. Now that we have it installed, let's power this baby up and see how much it draws. After powering the system on and spinning down the drives, we see a power draw of around 15.1 watts, compared to 10.5 watts without the GPU, which is pretty good but also very far from the claimed 1 watt. So I started digging. The first thing I wanted to check is whether we have ASPM or Active State Power Management enabled for the card. ASPM lets your PCIe devices enter a sleep mode, in which they draw very little power, and since pretty much every device on your motherboard is connected to the chipset or the CPU via PCIe, this can have a major impact on your power consumption. I already have ASPM force enabled via a bootloader option, So let's see if the graphics card supports it. I'm going to use a pretty convoluted command to find that out, which I'm going to put down in the video description. Ideally, you want to see ASPM L1 supported and enabled across the board for all of your devices. And as you can see, despite having ASPM support, the Intel Arc GPU doesn't have it enabled. So I'm going to use the ASPM tuning script made by Luis R. Rodriguez, which I'll also put down in the description. This script explicitly enables ASPM for the specified PCIe devices. So let's just copy the PCIe addresses for all of our devices that don't have ASPM enabled and paste them into the script. I also made sure that every device had the appropriate ASPM level enabled. So for devices that only support L1, we need to switch our mode to 2. And for devices that support both L1 and L0S, we need to switch it to 3. The script is pretty well documented, so go ahead and check it out if you want to know more. Now let's save and quit, and then we're going to run the script. And once we're done with that, we're actually going to verify that all of our PCIe devices now have ASPM enabled. And they do. But the important question is, did all of that do anything for our power consumption? And the answer is no. Unfortunately, despite my best efforts, the power consumption still stayed at around 15 to 16 watts, which is a shame. Still, 4 watts for a dedicated GPU is also not a bad deal, unless it's like a third of your overall power consumption. Now let's pass the card through to our Jellyfin container and finally see how Intel Arc performs when it comes to hardware transcoding. I'm running NixOS, which is a bit different when it comes to setting up Docker containers. But ultimately we just need to find out the render device that's associated with our graphics card. I know that render D128 is the integrated Intel card because I've already tested it in Jellyfin. So we need to go into our Docker container declaration and replace render D128 with render D129. After that, I'm going to execute NixOS rebuild switch, and once that's done, we can go into our Jellyfin web UI and look at the performance. Since this movie is HDR, we're going to need to use tone mapping so that when you play it on an SDR display, the image won't look washed out. Aside from the software tone mapping that runs on the CPU and uses OpenCL, Intel also offers VPP tone mapping, which runs on the GPU. I've decided to test both this time. With VPP tone mapping enabled, the Intel Arc unsurprisingly blows the i3-6100 out of the water with 75 FPS. And with the hardware tone mapping disabled, we see a figure of around 65 FPS, so I guess there's no reason not to use it. When it comes to power consumption, we get a 4.5 to 5 watt increase at idle when compared to the base system with no eGPU, as already mentioned. With hardware tone mapping enabled, we're looking at a total system power consumption of 48 watts during a 4K video transcode. And with software tone mapping, this goes down by 2 watts, bringing us to 46 watts. I've also run the same Jellyfin ffmpeg script with the Arc GPU, and here's what the results look like. In the 1080p H264 test, we get a whopping 313 FPS, 10 times more than the i3-6100. The 4K H264 video gives us 81 FPS, which is also quite a jump. The 8-bit 1080p HEVC test shows an impressive 235 FPS. And finally, a 4K 10-bit HEVC file gives us an average speed of 34 FPS. It's also worth mentioning that throughout the tests, the fan on the Arc GPU hasn't even budged, and the heatsinks stay pretty cool to the touch. That might change once you do multiple transcodes, but with only one transcode, the GPU stayed cool as a cucumber. So, what do we think about the performance? Well, 75 FPS is very impressive. Definitely an improvement from less than 10 FPS on our integrated GPU. And the numbers for other video formats are also a huge leap from the i3-6100. However, if you have a Skylake chip like this i3-6100, there's actually a way cheaper fix for your video transcoding woes, and it's called Intel i3-7100. Despite being just a generation newer, Kaby Lake chips come with an all-new iGPU, HD630. And apart from things like HDR tone mapping and support for 10-bit HEVC, this iGPU features way better performance. I've redone the tests with an Intel Pentium G4600, which is a dual-core Kaby Lake chip, and the results are pretty crazy. With VPP tone mapping enabled, we get around 52 FPS when transcoding the 4K HDR movie, while the system draws around 38 watts from the wall. With software tone mapping, we get 65 FPS, same as in the Intel Arc. The power consumption also increases though, to around 44 watts. 65 FPS is more than double the speed of the original movie, which is 24 FPS. So this is definitely going to be enough to play back the movie and not worry about buffering. And here are what the results look like for other video formats. 142 FPS for 1080p H264, 43 FPS for 4K H264, 71 FPS for 8-bit 1080p HEVC, and 18 FPS for 10-bit 4K HEVC. Not as good as the Intel Arc, but for only a tenth of the price, I'd say it's good enough. So if you have a Skylake chip and a motherboard that also supports Kaby Lake chips, don't buy the Arc, just get a Kaby Lake CPU. They're like 15 euros used. The only reason you'd maybe want to get an Arc GPU instead is if you somehow need AV1 support. And if you have a newer Intel chip, there are even less reasons to get one. In my last video, where I tested a cheap no-name laptop with an Intel Core i5-1260p, we got as much as 82 FPS on an integrated GPU with the same video file. And starting with the 11th gen, Intel CPUs also come with support for AV1 decode, so there's basically no point in getting an ARC card. So to sum it up, the only people I can recommend this card to when it comes to video transcoding are those of you who run systems without an integrated GPU and are not interested in a complete system upgrade. Or maybe if you have a system based on an AM4 Pro APU, like the one I covered in one of my earlier videos. In this case, getting an ARC GPU will basically cover you on all fronts: performance, ECC support, and media transcoding. But if you have a 7th gen or newer Intel chip with integrated graphics, you probably shouldn't buy an external GPU for video transcoding. And that's not limited to Intel Arc. These days, even NVIDIA GPUs provide very little performance compared to QuickSync. So there you have it, guys. I hope this video was helpful for you, and as usual, I would like to thank my patrons: James Uppington, Kevin Ware, Alessandro Colori, Carlos Bonilla, David Love, Jabastica, Robust Jim of Crypto, and everyone else who supports this channel. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.